Throughout the Bible, we have a number of people that we would call heroes of the faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, there's a list of some of these people as they talk about the works that they did and the faith that they had. And one of the people on that list is a man named David. And in this study, we're going to look at the life of David. David was a son. He was a shepherd boy. He was a soldier, and he was a king, one of the kings of Israel. And so we're going to take a look at the different segments and stories of his life that we find in the Bible and ask the question, what can we learn from the life of David? The next story that we have about David, after he has been anointed, and then who knows how much time goes on, but a period of time goes by, and what we're introduced next is to war. The Philistines, one of the enemies of the Israelites, came to attack them. And it's interesting if you look at the geography of it. So they came from this coastal area, and then the army of the Israelites came out and met them, and there was kind of this pinch point where, these guys are on a high ground and these guys are on a high ground, and there's this valley between them, and so you can't really send your army down to attack without getting slaughtered because they have the high ground, and that's an pretty important tactic or advantage. And so there was this thing that they would do, and the Philistines put this in play there, where they would send out their best fighter, and then Israel was supposed to send out their best fighter, and they would fight in one-on-one combat, and then whoever won, that would be the war. Now, whether or not it got honored very much, I'm not sure. But that was the idea behind it. And that's what happened here, is we have this character that comes on the scene, this Philistine soldier named Goliath. Now, this is probably one of the most well-known stories from the Old Testament that people know. In fact, when we think of Goliath, we just think of something that was ginormous, huge. If you're an angler like myself, you probably know about the Goliath grouper, this massive fish. We don't have them here in Nova Scotia, but I've seen videos of guys fishing for them, and they're insane. Anyway, I don't want to get off topic with fishing because I could. But he was this huge guy, and he would come out and he would yell and say, Israel, send your greatest fighter to come and fight me. And he would mock them, and he would mock God. And what effect did this have on the soldiers of Israel? They were terrified, absolutely terrified. The text tells us that David's older brothers, that they had gone off to the war, but David had stayed back with his father. And some time had gone on, and his father wanted a report of how things were going. So he puts together a bunch of supplies, some food and whatnot, and says to David, go and take this up to the war and check on your brothers and see how things are going. And so David does that. He takes the supplies, and he goes up into the encampment, and he finds his brothers there. And he also bears witness to Goliath. And David gets angry. He gets pretty upset about this. Who is this guy to mock our God, to talk down to us, the people of God, and how come no one's willing to fight him? And so he says, well, what would be done for the one who would strike this guy down? And so some of the soldiers around comment and stuff, and his brother gets upset with him, and this little altercation happens, but ultimately, it plays out that David is now before King Saul. And David says, I'll fight this guy. I'll take him on. And Saul's response to him is, you are but a youth, and Goliath has been a man of war since his youth. Who are you to take him on? And I love David's response. David, in chapter 17, verse 34, we get this response to Saul. So in verse 33, Saul says, but Saul replied, you cannot go fight the Philistine. You're just a youth, but he has been a warrior since he was young. And in verse 34, David replies, David answered Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Then David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." I love that answer of David. I think it speaks volumes to us today about testimony. We'll get to that. But about recognizing that we're not in this alone. And David, so he recants this story of his time in the field. And this is why I say that the whole idea that David was like the runt of the litter or this little scrawny guy does not hold up at all. Lions and bears, these are top predators. Like these are the top of the food chain, you know? Yeah. I've been near both of these animals. Bears in the wild, lions in captivity. And regardless of if they're in a cage or if they're right there outside of the cage, these are some terrifying creatures. And David's response is, when they came and took my sheep, I struck them down and I killed them. And God was with me then. He'll be with me now. And then the story goes that Saul's like, all right, well here, you got to take my armor. Like you're not even dressed for this. So he puts on his armor, and David's response is, man, I can't wear this. I haven't tested it. I don't really know it. I'm not familiar with it. And it makes sense in what we're about to see, right? So he goes down to this brook and he takes a number of stones and he has a sling. And that is something that so many people just gloss over and they don't really talk about. And we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about it. But he goes down and he makes his way down to the floor where Goliath was waiting. Goliath yells at him and taunts him. And David responds to him and says, you have mocked the living God. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut off your head. An interesting note, David didn't have a cutting weapon at all. And then he comes out, and Goliath, there's this brief altercation that happens. But before they even get the distance that people are anticipating for the fight, David takes his sling and he spins it around and he shoots this rock out and he hits Goliath right in the forehead and it sinks into his skull and he's down. David jumps up on him, pulls Goliath's own sword out, which comes back later in the book, and cuts off his head. And the Philistines run, and the Israelites pursue them, and the war is won because of a little shepherd boy who would not stand for his God to be mocked. What a story. Now, there's things we can talk about. The willingness to fight, the willingness to go and defend God and to be used as He wants, and the bravery that comes with that, and the recognizing that God was with me then, He'll be with me now. And I think this is a point that is so undermade and so forgotten about, is that is the power of testimony. When we look at the Bible, the historical books of the Bible, what we are reading about is God's interaction with men, right? And that is testimony. And we can look at that. Go read Psalm 66. And in that, there's this statement of, gather around those who fear the Lord, and I will tell you the great deeds He has done. And they sing this song, even about the difficult times that they went through as a nation of Israel. But God was with us, and He brought us through, and He tested us, and He brought us into a land of abundance. He put the dry land that we might cross. And that's the idea of testimony. And so it's another reason why it's important to know the Scriptures, is so we can look back and say, we serve a living God who has done wondrous things then. And then you can look into your own personal life and say, God was with me there, and He was with me there, and He was with me there. And it's not always these glamorous events. David going out into the field and having a lion or a bear come, sure, it's an intimidating moment, But as a shepherd in the wilderness, it's a common moment. Like, your flock is always under attack. And to have the statement that God was with me then, it's not this extravagant, showy thing that is going to draw crowds in to bear witness to, but it's true. And a lot of the times, God's faithfulness is displayed in simple moments in our life. And it's important as a Christian to remind yourself, to spend time reminiscing over the things that you have seen God do in the Bible, in your life, and in the lives of your brothers and sisters and throughout church history. Because then when you come and you face a trial and you face a difficult time, your response is, God was with me then, He's with me now. He rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear, and He'll be with me now. And I think that's just a wonderful truth, a wonderful thing to hold on to. Now, the other thing that we must pull from this story is the importance of the slinger. So, in ancient warcraft, in warcraft during this time, you have a number of types of soldiers, right? So you have Goliath. You have this big guy, heavy armor, but armor that he could still move around in a little bit. He's got his sword. He's got a javelin, for throwing a distance thing, and he's got a spear for mid-distance. This was a hand-to-hand combat style. And the expectation was that when he came out and said, send your best fighter, and I will strike him down, and we will win the war, kind of thing, was that a swordsman, like himself, was to come and fight him. And then we have archers, and we're pretty familiar with archers today. We still see them in a lot of movies that go back to that time. And archery is one of our Olympic sports. It's a hobby that I have and many others have, archery. And then it's a hunting method as well, which is pretty cool. And so a bow and arrow, we're all pretty familiar with that. But the idea of a slinger is one that hasn't really been remembered as well throughout history as that of the swordsman or the archer. And the slinger, if you go back and you look at, the history of it, and even ancient artwork that depicts slingers shooting birds out of the sky. So there's an accuracy to it. And shooting with great speed. The rock that David sent out sunk into the skull of Goliath. And I remember years ago when I was preparing a sermon on this, and I was doing some research into what a slinger was. Effectively, it was it was like bringing a pistol to a knife fight. And that's exactly what David did. Is he went down there, and there was this cultural expectation that he's going to match sword with sword. But here's one of the things that we can pull out from this is God doesn't play by our rules. God's not interested with the cultural norms and the cultural things that say unspoken rules of, here in Canada you have to do this and you have to do that. God's not interested in that. He doesn't really care about that. As I said many times before, God has His own culture that He's desiring to bring about, and God will not be mocked. And so the Philistines and even the Israelites expected this answer of sword to sword, and God sent a slinger to win the war. And it was a very interesting thing. It's another point that could be made of the idea that when we face problems, don't expect God's solutions to look like the solutions of man. When you go through the Bible, Moses is leading the Israelites out of captivity, and this army is pursuing. And what does God do? He brings them to the Red Sea. Who on earth would go there? When we look at, I had another one there for a second. But when we look at these stories throughout the Bible, the answer that God brings, Jericho, they come to the city of Jericho, and there's this war that's going to take place. And what's God's strategy for beating Jericho? March around the thing for 7 days and blow some horns, and the whole thing comes crashing down. And there's historical evidence that took place. The Bible and outside the Bible, like archaeological evidence of it. But there's this understanding that God's ways are not man's ways. God doesn't play by the rules that man sets up. God doesn't need to. He's the creator of all. He is in charge. He is in authority. And so when we see a problem and God says, hey, I want to use you to solve this problem, our answer is yes. And when he says, this is how we're going to do it, and you might think, this sounds crazy. God knows what he's doing. He's in charge. He's faithful. He's trustworthy. He's true. He's proven himself time and time again. And so that's what we're going to pull out from this section today. Don't be concerned with the culture of the world. Don't be concerned with obeying the ways of man. Be faithful to God. Trust in him. It's an important truth.